Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to look at one of the absolute most fundamental power shifts in human history, the transition from secret oral traditions to public, democratic text in the ancient world. We often take for granted that the laws governing our lives are written down and, well, accessible to pretty much anyone with an internet connection. But it wasn't always that way. Not at all. Today we're going to see how ancient whistleblowers and the truly revolutionary invention of written public text absolutely shattered the elite monopolies on justice.
Okay, let's dive into this. I want you to imagine, just for a second, a society where you are held completely accountable to a strict set of rules, but you aren't actually allowed to read them. In fact, only the rich and powerful, the elites, actually know the rules of the game. If you have a dispute with a wealthy landowner, that same landowner's social class gets to decide what the ancient invisible law actually says. It sounds like a completely rigged game, doesn't it? Well, in the archaic societies of the Mediterranean, this was literally just everyday reality. So, before written statutes were even a thing, justice was administered almost entirely by elite priests and aristocratic families. And how did they keep track of these laws? They relied on professional rememberers. These individuals were known as Mnemones. The Mnemones memorized the laws, which were actually often sung or chanted, and they maintained the unwritten oral traditions. Because you couldn't just go look up a law in a book, you had to rely on these Mnemones and the aristocratic magistrates to essentially tell you what the law was. As you can guess, this turned the entire concept of justice into a highly exclusive tool of oligarchic control.
Now, this highly arbitrary system was a massive problem for the commoners. It inevitably led to intense social friction. Without a fixed public standard to point to, judgments were incredibly inconsistent, and they systematically favored the upper classes. For the average person, this resulted in severe debt crises where people were literally being enslaved to pay off creditors. And it gets worse. Without an objective state system to handle these disputes, families basically just resorted to private vengeance. This sparked endless, violent blood feuds that genuinely threatened to tear society apart. It was just a completely unsustainable environment of instability across the ancient Mediterranean world.
So let's transition to our first major historical shift. Athens, laws on wood, in 621 BCE.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive technological and political leap that happened next. To prevent that arbitrary aristocratic judgment of the past, the Athenian assembly commissioned a man named Draco, who was actually an aristocrat himself, to draft the city's very first written constitution. We're looking at a huge jump here, from the old way, which was completely reliant on who you knew and what they claimed the gods wanted, to the new way, which was fixed, written down, and absolutely most importantly, public. Draco shifted justice away from a chaotic system of private vengeance and placed it firmly into the hands of state-mediated adjudication.
To really grasp how revolutionary this was, you have to look at the physical media they used. The law wasn't hidden away in some dark temple anymore. Draco's laws, known as the tesmoi, were inscribed on these tactile, rotating wooden boards called axones, and they were displayed on these four-sided pyramidal pillars called kybes. They were placed right out in the public agora, the bustling center of Athenian life. For the very first time, the law was literally out in the open. Any literate citizen could just walk right up, spin the wooden board, and read exactly what the rules were.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the specific legal breakthrough Draco achieved. We usually just associate the guy with harshness, right? But his true genius was something much more profound. In his homicide law, he introduced a sophisticated legal distinction between premeditated murder, phonos ek pronoias, and involuntary manslaughter. By categorizing the actual intent behind a killing and assigning specific procedures for it, Draco created a formal, standardized due process. This was the exact mechanism that finally put an end to those endless, devastating cycles of private revenge.
But okay, we do have to address the elephant in the room here, his incredibly infamous reputation. The 4th century BCE orator Mnemones famously said that Draco's laws were written in blood. And honestly, it's true. His code prescribed death for nearly everything. I mean, even the theft of a cabbage could get you executed. This extreme severity is actually where we get the modern word draconian. The laws were so unimaginably harsh that most of them were repealed just a few decades later by the reformer Solon in 594 BCE. But here is the vital takeaway. Solon repealed the harsh punishments, yes, but he kept Draco's brilliant homicide law. And most importantly, he kept the written public format. The genie was finally out of the bottle.
Let's move on and see how this builds. Section 2, Rome's secret legal formulas.
Let's travel over to the early Roman Republic. Here in the Roman Forum, much like in Athens, early Rome was governed by unwritten customary laws, known as ius.
And these were completely controlled by the elite patrician class and their priests. But by 451 BCE, intense pressure from the common people, the plebeians, forced a major change. They demanded to know the rules. So a committee of 10 men, the decemvirs, was formed, and they famously published the 12 tables right here in the forum. Unwritten custom had finally become written statute, or lex.
But the Roman elites were incredibly clever. They basically created a massive loophole. They published the substantive rules, the what of the law, right? The 12 tables. But they hid the how. They kept the exact, rigid verbal formulas required to initiate a lawsuit, which were known as the legis actionis, a total secret. They also hid the dies fasti, the specific calendar days you were actually allowed to go to court. This crucial knowledge was hoarded by the pontiffs. So you might know your rights from reading the 12 tables, but without the magic words in the secret calendar, you had absolutely no standing in court. The patricians basically maintained their power through a strict clerical monopoly.
Which brings us to a dramatic turning point. Section 3, the Roman whistleblower, 34 BCE.
It took almost 150 years for this loophole to finally close, and it happened because a single ancient insider decided to act. Think of this as the ancient equivalent of a modern whistleblower leaking highly classified documents to the public. Enter a man named Gnaeus Flavius. Now, Flavius wasn't a priest or some wealthy patrician. He was a legal writer and a clerk, serving as secretary to a very prominent Roman official named Appius Claudius Caecus. In his role as a clerk, Flavius had access to the files. He quietly used his clerical position to study and copy the secret procedural formulas and the closely guarded court calendar straight from the elites. So the crucial point is what he actually did with that information. Around 304 BCE, Flavius published all of it in a collection that became known as the Just Flavianum. He revealed the secret legis actionis and the dies fasti. He literally stripped the law of its pontifical ritual secrecy. By leaking these formulas, Flavius effectively open-sourced Roman law. For the very first time, non-priests and everyday citizens had the actual procedural tools to navigate legal actions themselves. He broke the priest's monopoly once and for all.
And that leads us to our final act, Section 4, the birth of public justice.
These actions by Draco in Athens and Gnaeus Flavius in Rome, they weren't just isolated historical footnotes. They were the seismic shifts that laid the absolute groundwork for the modern democratic jurisprudence we rely on today. When Flavius leaked those documents, he initiated a profound transformation. This democratization allowed Roman legal science to completely decouple from theology. The law was no longer a sacred, secret pontifical ritual. It became a secular, flexible, and highly analytical profession. And under the watchful eye of the Capitoline wolf, a powerful symbol of an evolving, expansive Rome, this newfound flexibility allowed Roman magistrates to develop the jus gentium, the law of nations, adapting their rigid systems to govern a vast, diverse Mediterranean world based on common legal reasoning.
When we map out this massive historical arc, we can see exactly how this builds. In 621 BCE, Draco uses those tactile wooden axones to shift Athens to a state-mediated system. Then, in 451 BCE, the decimvirs give Rome the 12 tables, transitioning unwritten custom into written lex for equal protection. And then we get the vital final puzzle piece in 304 BCE. Gnaeus Flavius publishes the secret procedures, secularizing jurisprudence entirely. Both Athens and Rome, through distinct but remarkably similar paths, systematically dismantled elite legal monopolies through the undeniable power of public text.
So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. If the law isn't accessible to everyone, is it really law at all? Or is it just a weapon wielded by the powerful? The transition from the secret songs of the Mnemones to those spinning wooden axones in the public square, it wasn't just a change in technology, it was a literal revolution in human rights. It reminds us that the fight against information gatekeeping isn't just some modern digital issue we're facing today, it is a timeless human struggle. Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me today, and keep questioning the rules of the game.